2 Samuel chapter 4, it's going to come up on the screen behind. Is this microphone on? Yes, it is. Okay, 2 Samuel chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. When Saul heard that Abner had died in Hebron, he lost heart, and all Israel was troubled. Now Saul's son had 2 men who were captains of troops. The name of one was Baanah, the name of the other Rechab, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite of the children of Benjamin. For Beeroth also was part of Benjamin, because the Beerothites fled to Gittaim and have been sojourners there until this day. Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son who was lame in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened, as she made haste to flee, that he fell and became lame. His name was Mephibosheth. Then the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, Rechab and Baanah, set out and came at about the heat of the day to the house of Ishbosheth, who was lying on his bed at noon. And they came there, all the way into the house, as though to get wheat, and they stabbed him in the stomach. Then Rechab and Baanah, his brother, escaped. For when they came into the house, he was lying on his bed in his bedroom. Then they struck him and killed him, beheaded him, and took his head, and were all night escaping through the plain. And they brought the head of Ishbosheth to David at Hebron, and said to the king, "Here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. And the Lord has avenged my lord, the king, this day of Saul and his descendants." But David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon, the Beerothite, and said to them, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from all adversity, when someone told me, saying, 'Look, Saul is dead,' thinking to have brought me good news, I arrested him and had him executed in Ziklag. The one who thought I would give him a reward for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous person in his own house, on his own bed? Therefore, shall I not require his blood at your hands and remove you from the earth?" So David commanded his young men, and they executed them, cut off their hands and feet, and hanged them by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner in Hebron.
It's even better now. Just to say as well, we've got loads of kids in here. And kids, I think you do brilliant on a Sunday. Because you're not allowed to, run around as much, but I think you do really, really well. So well done, kids. And also to you parents, I can see you sometimes getting twitchy because the kids are moving, and we don't mind a bit of noise, we don't mind a bit of twitching. If they're going mad, you can take them into the hall. And if you get really loud kids, you might have to go into the hall. But don't worry, parents, about a bit of noise or a bit of twitching. It's fine, and we'd rather have that than not have any kids here. So kids, it's ace to see you on a Sunday. Yeah. Who said that? That's what most of you were thinking, isn't it? Yeah. If I was to preach today's sermon in one sentence, I'd say this: that God's kingdom must come through faithfulness and righteousness, and not through shortcuts or manipulation. God's kingdom must come through faithfulness and righteousness, not through shortcuts and manipulation. Frustrates you, doesn't it, when people take shortcuts? If you had work done at your home and people took a shortcut, it's frustrating. You paid for it. It's frustrating when people manipulate situations to get the result that they want. And we're very quick to look at other people, aren't we? And maybe you've done it yourself, but you go for a quick fix rather than a proper fix. Maybe you've done some DIY or something similar, or you've done it spiritually. You've gone for a quick fix rather than a proper fix. Well, the way that God wants his kingdom to work in us isn't by manipulation. It isn't by shortcuts. It's by faithfulness and righteousness. Or, as we'll look quite a bit today, faithfulness and integrity. God wants his kingdom to grow in faithfulness and with integrity. And we need to think through what that looks like, because we can never do that perfectly. We can never be perfectly faithful. We can never be perfectly righteous. We can never show perfect integrity. And that's why the most faithful and full of integrity person in the world still needs Jesus. But in church life and home life and Christian life, God's concerned not just with results, he wants integrity. He wants faithfulness. I'd say every time that the Lord's more concerned with faithfulness and integrity over flair, over competency, over ideas, over numbers, over finances, over activity. God's kingdom must come in the right way. Faithfulness and integrity really do matter. And so in lots of areas of life, shortcuts are available, aren't they? We looked at some of the ways in the kids' talk, some of the ways that people cheat and take shortcuts. It can be in other ways. It can be, you think of drugs in sport. You think of gazumping people in property sales. You think of not quite telling the whole truth in business. But with God's kingdom, it must be different. In the church, it must be different. In our lives, it must be different. Faithfulness and integrity really do matter. So if I can put it this way, God isn't just a boss who cares about getting the job done and getting the results. It has to be done the right way. The right things must be done the right way. When God's kingdom was announced through Jesus, Jesus didn't take shortcuts. Jesus didn't parachute in and go straight to the cross. He lived a full, righteous, faithful life. He took no shortcuts. When he was hungry, he made himself eat food. When he was tired, he slept. Jesus didn't cheat. Now, over the last few weeks, we've been seeing this transition between Saul's kingdom and David's kingdom, two very different kingdoms. We've covered it in 4 chapters, and various people have tried to speed things up or take shortcuts by doing dodgy things. But it took 7.5 years to transition from Saul's kingdom to David's kingdom, because God's kingdom had to come the right way. Remember our formula for thinking all this through? That we said, at our best, we're like David. And at David's best, he's like Jesus. At his best, David's faithful and he acts with integrity. At his best, David doesn't take shortcuts. And in that, he's like Jesus. David's kingdom, David's kingship, they're pointers to what Jesus' kingdom and Jesus' kingship would be. Not perfectly, but reasonably. At our worst, today we're like Rahab and Baanah. And they're like Satan, and they represent their methods, which can creep in, their methods represent the kingdom of this world. So we've pretty much reached the end of this transition between Saul and David's kingdom. We're going to look at how it all pans out today. And we're going to, this passage really does break down simply into 3 parts. You've got a problem, a shortcut, and a solution. A problem, a shortcut, and a solution. First of all, then, the problem. And the problem we've got in verse 1 to 4 is a failed kingdom. A failed kingdom. Saul's kingdom has failed. The kingdom of this world has failed. Saul's kingdom were all about stealth and strength. Saul's kingdom were all about ambition and what's impressive. Saul was interested in results. Saul was interested in getting things done. And the end for Saul justified the means. You see it in the way that Saul refuses to wait for Samuel to arrive and he takes the priestly role upon himself. You see it in the way that Saul hacks down the priests to get to David. as long as he gets the result. Saul was tall, handsome, charismatic, impressive, ruthless, but he didn't have integrity and he didn't have faithfulness. And that's what led to his downfall. He constantly acted in ways that offered an instant solution rather than a righteous solution. He regularly took things into his own hands. He was jealous of the success of others. He went back on his word. And Samuel famously says to him in 1 Samuel 13, "You have done foolishly. You've not kept the commandment of the Lord, which he commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom forever. Now your kingdom's not going to continue. The Lord sought for himself a man after his own heart, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And we saw a few weeks ago now, Saul dies a tragic death, and his kingdom begins to disintegrate. His kingdom ends with him. In the first 4 verses, we see 3 examples of how Saul's kingdom had failed. Firstly, we see his son Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth's next in line, but he's weak. Abner sets him up as a puppet king, and he's scared to death of Abner, but now Abner's dead. And Ishbosheth loses heart. Literally, he gives up. And we read that all Israel is troubled. They're all scared. Why are they scared? Why is he scared? He knows that the throne's lost. But now he thinks that he's next. If Abner's been killed, surely they're coming for me next. Surely David's coming for me next. If that's the case, he's failed to see David's heart, because David's not like that. But the bottom line is Ishbosheth is finished. Saul's line is finished. Secondly, we're told in verse 2 to 3 that the defense of Israel has been left to 2 ruthless cowards. We'll hear about them later, but Rechab and Baanah, they're the captains of Saul's troops. They're half the men that Abner were, and Abner wasn't a good bloke. The New King James says they were captains of the troop. The other versions say that he led the raiding parties. They were bandits. And they're the ones that are in charge with the security of the kingdom. Thirdly, we see Mephibosheth. We feel sorry for Mephibosheth because, well, he's included to show us there's no viable alternative to Ishbosheth. Because Mephibosheth is crippled. When Saul died, Mephibosheth is Jonathan's son. His nurse took him to run to safety, because often when a king died, the ambitious enemies had killed the relatives and try and claim power. Well, Mephibosheth were only little, and his nurse ran with him in her arms, and she fell, and she dropped him, and he was crippled. And in those days, a king had to be able to lead his army into battle. Mephibosheth couldn't do that. He was crippled, and he couldn't lead. So Saul's kingdom's failed. That's what we're supposed to see in verse 1 to 4. Saul's kingdom's failed. It's heartless, it's corrupt, it's weak. It's got a weak king, a corrupt, immoral military, and no alternative. It's a bleak picture, and it's a reminder of this. Ultimately, every kingdom built on human values and human strength will end up like this one. The kingdoms of this world will end up like Saul's kingdom. We'll see that as we go through Revelation. Saul's kingdom's failed. The kingdom of self is destined to fail. The kingdom of self-sufficiency, self-confidence, self-preservation will fail. The systems that this kind of kingdom represents will fail. We must keep that in perspective, because sometimes it looks like we're failing. Society as society exists at this present time will fail. Our society will fail. So what could be done? Well, we'll look at what some people wanted to do in verse 5 to 8. The shortcut. And the shortcut comes in the form of a flawed coup. We've had a failed kingdom. Used alliteration today. You'll be well pleased. A failed kingdom. Now we've got a flawed coup. We come back to Rechab and Baanah. These were 2 opportunist thugs. They saw this is our chance to strike. We're not gonna win the kingdom now through Ishbosheth. We're not going to win the kingdom through Saul's line. And so just like Abner before them, they think, well, we still need to try and get ourselves a seat at the top table. We still need to look after ourselves. So what do we do? Ishbosheth's weak. Ishbosheth's troubled. He's there for the taking. This is what we'll do. We'll kill him and we'll take his head to David. And David will reign because he ain't got a rival anymore. And we'll be the ones who delivered his enemy to him. So we'll get a seat at the top table. We'll make it happen. See what they're doing? They're acting with the kingdom of self's values. We'll look after number one. The ends justify the means. And look at verse 5 to 7. This is planned. We're told the weather's hot. They know that Ishbosheth, he likes to have a nap in the middle of the day, and so they pretend that they're collecting stores for the wheat from the stores, and they sneak into the house. That shows you how weak the kingdom is, that the king, they can just walk into his house. And while he's asleep on his bed, they murder him. Aren't they brave? Just in case we miss how brave they are, we're told again in verse 7, they killed him while he was lying on his bed. And in verse, I think, 10 or 11, David says, you killed him while he was lying on his bed. Rechab and Baanah are cowards. The end justifies the means. We'll do whatever it takes to get what we need. Why is the plan flawed? Well, the plan's flawed because they've completely misunderstood the king's heart. They've completely misunderstood David's heart. In all the years that Saul hunted him, did David ever seek to harm his enemy? Did David ever seek to hurt Saul's family? Even when Saul was in David's grasp and David could take him and kill him, David refuses to harm his enemy. David mourned for Saul. If Rechab and Baanah were spiritual at all, they'd have known that. They probably weren't aware, but were aware. The last person who thought he'd delivered David's enemy to him got a rude awakening. See, Rechab and Baanah were so desperate to get their way, so desperate to have a place in the kingdom, so desperate to look after themselves, that they'd do whatever it took to get there. And the problem was they'd misunderstood the heart of the king. And I think if we slow things down there, in church life, in home life, our logic can be so flawed, our actions can be so wrong, because we don't understand the heart of our king. We don't understand what God's like. Our God's gentle and lowly. Our king is gentle. Our king's kind. Our king's merciful. Our king's patient. Our king isn't rough. Our king isn't quick-tempered. Our king never says, well, the end justifies the means. And they think they've been ever so clever because when they come to David, they couch their actions in spiritual language. We can do that, can't we? Here is the head of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, your enemy, who sought your life. And the Lord has avenged my lord, the king, this day, of Saul and his descendants. What they're saying is, look, David, God's done this. This is providence. They remind David, Saul sought your life. But we've been God's agents because we've avenged you on behalf of the Lord, David. What they don't say is, well, we deceived the guard, snuck into his bedroom and killed him while he was asleep because we want a seat at the table. But people don't say that, do they? We couch our shortcuts, we couch our manipulations in theological language. One writer says that many people have got blood on their hands and theology on their lips. Some of the cruelest things done in church life are accompanied by scriptures. God is the avenger of his people. What they've said's right. What they were saying is true, but they've been deceitful. They've got good theology on their lips, but blood on their hands. There are people who use good theology, but use it for wicked purposes. How can we have good theology on our lips, but blood on our hands? Do we trick people? Do we omit to tell people things so that we can get our way? And then when it comes out, say, oh, we didn't mean it like that. And you should show more grace. Do we put a theological slant on our actions that makes our actions hard to challenge when we know we've been sneaky? One writer summarizes Rechab and Baanah like this. They say, Christian, never compromise righteousness, even when you imagine that good will come of some unrighteous action. I doubt that you will be tempted to think that an assassination is called for to advance the gospel. But in our own day, it's more common than we like to think for Christians to try to advance God's kingdom by disgraceful and unworthy means. Be sure that you love righteousness more than success. That hits, doesn't it? Be sure that you love righteousness more than success. Be sure that you love doing the right thing more than getting your own way. So here we are in church, and it's an AGM. And I know, if I'm honest about the church finances, that you'll never agree to do the things that I want to set out in our church vision. So I base the figures to do the things that we want to do in our church vision on last year's figures, knowing that last year we had a one-off massive gift from someone. But I don't tell you that. I just say, well, last year's figures show we can afford it. Now, I haven't done that. Chris wanted me to, but I said no. But if my end goal is to get these good things done, does it matter how I get there? If I really do believe these are good things for the church, does it matter how I get there? Does it matter that I omit things? Does it matter that I'm a bit sneaky in doing it? Of course it does, because faithfulness and integrity matter. The end doesn't justify the means. Or we're keen for something not to happen in the church, or not to happen in whatever. And so we filter out snippets of truth to people. We tell people half a story. We represent things in a special way. And in the end, what happens, happens. And it probably is the best result for the church. But does it matter do the ends justify the means? Of course they don't. Because faithfulness and integrity matter. And so in the desperation to have a place at the table, Rechab and Baanah, they sneakily and cowardly they don't do what's right, but the result ends up being right because they clear the line for David. But that was God's job to do, not Rechab and Baanah's. And very interestingly, as they behave cowardly and sneakily, the lips drip with theology. We've done this for the Lord. Finally, what's the answer? So we've got a failed kingdom, a flawed coup. Any clues? A faithful king. I had to think about that one. A faithful king, verse 9 through to verse 12. We're going to work through David's response to them, but before I do, I want to pick out three things that show us David were a faithful king. Firstly, he recalls to them, look, it was the Lord that redeemed me from all my adversity. If Rechab and Baanah had misunderstood God's character, David didn't misunderstand it. David understood God's character, and that's really, really important. David understood how God works. That's the reason David didn't have to manipulate. If we understand how God works, we don't have to take shortcuts. We don't have to manipulate. David knew that God vindicated his people, and so he didn't need to do it. David could look back at his life, especially at the time when he were on the run from Saul, and he had the chance to take a shortcut and take the kingdom and kill Saul, but instead he waited and he trusted for the Lord to vindicate him, and he did. We don't always see it at the time, I know I don't, but we can look back at it. It is encouraging, isn't it, when we look back at those times where we've been tempted to deal with a situation, tempted to respond to a situation with worldly wisdom or fight fire with fire. And I can say this, that in the times when I've trusted the Lord, he has delivered me and kept me from manipulation and shortcut. He has vindicated. Secondly, David could recall his previous form. So he reminds him, he says, do you remember what happened to the last bloke that tried to manipulate me by killing my enemy? I killed him. So David could look back and say, well, I've acted justly in the past. Thirdly, he acted justly now. He's consistent. He has Rechab and Baanah executed for treason, and he then gives Ishbosheth's body a dignified burial. Why? Because David's a faithful king. David doesn't, at this point, take shortcuts. David doesn't manipulate. You can imagine the scene, can't you? If it wasn't so horrible, it'd make me laugh. But halfway through David's speech in verses 10 to 11, I can imagine Rechab and Baanah looking at one another as if to say, I think we might have misread this. I think we might have got this one wrong. And the plans come crashing down. And they pay for it with their lives. I think this section that we've looked at over the last 4 weeks, and also David's behaviour here, tells us some really important things, both as instruction to us on how we should behave, but also as lessons to us on how our king behaves. Up until now, David's a man who seeks to make peace with his enemies rather than war. That should always be our aim. Peace isn't always possible, but it's always our aim. In Luke 9, when James and John want to call fire from heaven on people that oppose Jesus, Jesus says, "You don't know what manner of spirit you are. I didn't come to destroy men's lives, I came to save them." Does Jesus act with justice? Absolutely he does. Will Jesus eventually destroy lives? Absolutely he will. But that's not why he came. He came to save lives. And that's got to shape our dealings with people. Of course we have to act righteously. Of course there has to be things like church discipline and all them kind of things. But we're there for mercy. We're there to save lives. That's got to shape our dealings even with people who've not been our friends. We seek mercy. We seek the good. But eventually we have to act with justice. Another key thing to learn is this, and I think this is crucial. This has been one of the biggest lessons the Lord's, I'd say taught me, but he's teaching me. That when we understand how our king behaves, we're willing to wait. David knew that God's kingdom couldn't be established by cheating, couldn't be established by deception. He knew that the ends don't justify the means. And he didn't take a shortcut because he understood who God was. He thought, I know who God is, I can wait. David knew the kingdom was his, but he didn't grasp at it. He didn't force it. He didn't manipulate it. And that draws my mind to Jesus in Philippians 2. Jesus is equal with God, but he doesn't grasp. Patiently waits. I think about Jesus, we mentioned it earlier, but Jesus is tempted by Satan as he starts his ministry. And Satan offers him all the things that God's kingdom would achieve. You know, he offers him the kingdoms of this world. He offers him all these things. But Jesus says effectively, no, I'll win my kingdom in righteousness. I'll wait. Waiting can be painful, can't it? You look at churches sometimes and people come in, rightly and wrongly sometimes, but people come in and they want to blast through everything. And you have to wait. We have to be patient sometimes. There are no shortcuts to establishing God's kingdom. It came through Jesus' hard-won righteousness. It came through Jesus' integrity and patience. And as his people, we've got to be the same. So many temptations, isn't there, to take shortcuts. Sometimes because we're thinking of a right result, but we mustn't take shortcuts. We mustn't fight fire with fire. Especially, I'd say, that when we're wounded or hurt, because that's the temptation. Proverbs 10:9 says, he who walks with integrity walks securely. But he who perverts his ways will become known. Psalm 41 says, as for me, you uphold me in my integrity and set me before your face forever. In Titus 2, verse 7, Paul writes to Titus, he says, show yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility. Psalm 31, the Lord preserves the faithful and fully repays the proud person. Maybe it's this, maybe you've received veiled threats from theological lips. I have. Maybe you're tempted to help things along with a bit of manipulation or shortcut or omitting something. I've been tempted to do that. We've got a king, not King David, we've got a king who, under tremendous pressure, under tremendous temptation throughout his life, never manipulated any situation, never cheated, never took a shortcut, always acted with integrity. One day, we'll see this in a couple of months, David's life falls apart because he does take a shortcut. And he doesn't act with integrity, he takes what he wants. We mustn't just presume that because we've acted with integrity so far that will never not. We constantly need to come to the only one who is perfectly trustworthy, perfectly righteous, perfectly full of integrity. Well, I do think we need to remember and preach these chapters to ourselves. And we need to remind ourselves of this. No power, this is what we've seen in the last few weeks, no power, no manipulation, no foolishness, no injustice can overcome God's plans for his kingdom. That's an encouragement. No power, no manipulation, no foolishness, no injustice can overcome God's kingdom. Do we get frustrated looking at laws that are passed, bills that are passed, agendas that are set in schools and in media? It winds you right up, doesn't it? Winds me up. None of that can overcome God's plans for his kingdom. You know, Abner couldn't do it, Joab couldn't do it, Baana couldn't do it, Rechab couldn't do it. Second thing we see is David acts as a faithful king. He acts as an example, but he points us to the ultimate faithful king who established his kingdom in absolute righteousness. Thirdly, we need to remember this: faithfulness and integrity generally do slow things down. We need to be aware of that, especially I think in church life. Faithfulness and integrity do slow things down. In this case, it slowed David down for 7.5 years. It slowed Jesus down, if we can say that, for 33 years. But it was important that they did the right things the right way. It's not the case that faithfulness and integrity are more important than success. I would say this: faithfulness and integrity are success. We're not called, it'd be great, we're not called to build bigger. We're not called to build better. We're not called to do all these things good as they are. That's not success. Faithfulness and integrity is success. Being able to say, I've been faithful, that's success. And God's kingdom comes no other way. God's kingdom must come through faithfulness and righteousness, not shortcuts and manipulations. We're going to close by singing what we're going to close by singing. I don't even know myself. But we are going to close by singing. Great is thy faithfulness.